This audio program is brought to you courtesy of Audible.com. Audible, audio that speaks to you wherever you are.
Tao Te Ching, Making This Life Significant, a Philosophical Translation, by Roger T. Ames and David L. Hall. Read by Ralph Lowenstein. Venture not beyond your doors to know the world. Making This Life Significant with the philosophers and friends at UTEP. Contents. Preface and Acknowledgements. Historical Introduction. Historical Context. The Nature and Applications of the Tao Te Ching. Philosophical Introduction. Correlative Cosmology and Interpretive Context. 1. Optimizing Experience, This Focus and Its Field. 2. Taoist Cosmology and Interpretive Context. 3. Getting the most out of one's ingredients. 4. Appreciating the particular. 5. The mutual entailing of opposites. 6. Aesthetic harmony. 7. Awareness. 8. The Wu forms. 9. The Wu forms as habit forming. Glossary of key terms. Introduction to the translation. Translation and commentary. Appendix. The Great One gives birth to the waters. Preface and Acknowledgements. The Tao Te Ching has probably been translated into the English language more often than any other piece of world literature. Why translate it again? An entirely reasonable question. And a reasonable question requires a reasoned answer. Recent archaeological finds, Ma Wang Dui, 1973, and Guo Dian, 1993, have provided us with textual materials that are physically more than a millennium earlier than previously available versions of the Tao Te Ching. Such finds challenge the authority of existing translations to the extent that these new materials have increased our knowledge of the text and of the circumstances of its transmission. And there is broad scholarly agreement that these early redactions of the Tao Te Ching do indeed cast important new light on the structure and the meaning of this defining document in Taoist philosophy. In addition to providing new insights into an old document, these archaeological finds have also provided us with textual materials that are importantly different from what has been available up until now, enabling us to resolve some persistent linguistic problems. Undoubtedly, the most substantial addition to the Tao Te Ching are the 14 strips, "The Great One gives birth to the waters," that appear as an integral element within one of the Guo Dian versions of the text. Beyond the seamless physical consistency of these strips with the rest of this early exemplar of the Tao Te Ching, they contain a discussion of Taoist cosmology that not only uses the familiar Tao Te Ching vocabulary, but further brings a clarity to this cosmology that enables us to understand other chapters of the Tao Te Ching in a way that has not been possible before. In deference to a continuing and yet inconclusive debate on the relationship between this exciting new portion of the text and the Tao Te Ching itself, we have followed the practice of excerpting this new document and of giving it the title, "The Great One gives birth to the waters." We have translated it and have discussed it in some detail in an appendix. Whatever the ultimate status of these strips with respect to the Tao Te Ching itself, their critical importance as a resource for illuminating the Taoist response to the cosmological question of the source and nature of creativity is nowhere in question. However, beyond the archaeological finds, there is, if possible, an even more compelling reason to take up the project of offering yet another English-language translation of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is a profoundly philosophical text, and yet it has not been treated as such. It has been translated and interpreted initially by missionaries, and more recently by sinologists. That is to say that, to date, the Tao Te Ching has only incidentally and tangentially been engaged by philosophers. This assertion is meant neither to impugn the usually good intentions of the missionaries, nor to pretend that there is any substitute for the sophisticated philological, historical, literary, and cultural sensibilities that we associate with good sinology. In fact, if there is an indictment to be made, it is to be directed against professional philosophy in our Western seats of learning that, in its own self-understanding, continues to insist that philosophy is exclusively an Anglo-European enterprise. Given this marginalization of other philosophical traditions, philosophy as a discipline has an unfulfilled responsibility to our academy. An essential occupation of philosophers is to identify and describe the generic traits of the human experience in order to locate problems within the broadest possible context. And these defining generic characteristics are importantly different as we move from one cultural and epochal site to another. Philosophers have the responsibility to seek out and to understand the uncommon assumptions that distinguish cultures as a preventative against cultural reductionism and the misconceptions such ethnocentrism entails. Thus, the absence of philosophers in the interpretation of Chinese philosophy has come at a cost. It has become a commonplace to acknowledge that, in the process of Western humanists attempting to make sense of the classical Chinese philosophical literature, many Western assumptions have inadvertently been insinuated into the understanding of these texts, and have colored the vocabulary through which this understanding has been articulated. Chinese philosophy has been made familiar to Western readers by first Christianizing it, and then more recently by locating it within a poetical, mystical, occult worldview. To the extent that Chinese philosophy has become the subject of Western philosophical interest at all, it has usually been analyzed within the framework of categories and philosophical problems not its own. The recent recovery of new versions of existing texts, and the further discovery of many that have been long lost, has occasioned the retranslation of many of the classics, and has provided both a pretext and an opportunity for philosophers to step up and rethink our standard readings. Most importantly, it has presented us with the challenge of trying, with imagination, to take these texts on their own terms by locating and interpreting them within their own worldview. The happy collaboration of Hall and Ames has, over nearly a quarter of a century, been an attempt, however imperfect, to bring together both sinological and philosophical skills, first in our interpretive studies of classical Chinese philosophy, and more recently in our new translations of seminal texts. In developing a strategy for our translations, benefiting enormously from the participation of Henry Rosemont, Jr. in these efforts, we have developed a structure that includes a philosophical introduction, an evolving glossary of key philosophical terms, a self-consciously interpretive translation, and the inclusion of a critical Chinese text. In describing our translations as self-consciously interpretive, we are not allowing that we are given to license, or that we are any less literal than other translations. On the contrary, we would insist that any pretense to a literal translation is not only naive, but is itself a cultural prejudice of the first order. To begin with, we would assert that English as the target language carries with it such an overlay of interpretation that, in the absence of reference to an extensive introduction and glossary, the philosophical import of the Chinese text is seriously compromised. Further, a failure of translators to be self-conscious and to take fair account of their own Gadamerian prejudices, with the excuse that they are relying on some objective lexicon that, were the truth be known, is itself heavily colored with cultural biases, is to betray their readers not once but twice. Just as each generation selects and carries over earlier thinkers to reshape them in its own image, each generation reconfigures the classical canons of world philosophy to its own needs. We, too, are inescapably people of a time and place, and a most cursory understanding of the Tao Te Ching itself would require that we acknowledge ourselves as such. This self-consciousness is not to distort the Tao Te Ching, but to endorse its premises. A lot has happened as we worked on this translation. Tragically, the David Hall side of the project that burned most brightly also burned most quickly, and in the company of family and friends, he died in his desert one spring day. The profound sadness and sense of loss is made bearable by a compounding of happiness in a collaboration that only got better over the years, because it always attracted further collaboration. Along the way, many friends and colleagues have added to the enjoyment and satisfaction that we were always able to find in our work. The formidable D.C. Lau, with a comment here and an allusion there, has given us things to think about with respect to the Tao Te Ching specifically, and over the years with respect to Chinese philosophy broadly, that have returned to our thoughts regularly for further reflection. Clifford Ames and Owen Luck, keepers of the English language, interrogated an earlier version of the manuscript with a thoroughness that left not a single sentence unconfessed. And Geir Sigurdsson spent many hours on the banks of Wei Ming Hu, rescuing our introduction from itself. Xing Wen lent a steady hand to some technical problems with the text, and Danny Coyle searched the final manuscript for infelicities. Robin Yates, with remarkable tact and good sense, saved us from a reading of Chapter 77 that was too clever by half. And dear Bonnie interrupted her own sabbatical to further discipline these pages. Over the years, Daniel Cole has, with precision and with art, made the most of the presentation of our work, and without him there would be far less beauty in this world. When the time came, Tracy Bernstein and Allison Dickens stepped up as editors for Ballantine and gave us every opportunity to make the most of our efforts. Finally, I personally want to express my deep gratitude to my graduate students at Peking University, who, in our comparative philosophy seminar in the fall of 2001, challenged me to think long and hard about Taoist cosmology, and who enabled me to see things that David had known all along. Roger T. Ames, Peking University, April 2002. Historical Introduction. Historical Context. The Warring States period, 403 to 221 BCE, in which the Tao Te Ching was born, is fairly named. As time passed, internecine warfare raged with escalating ferocity among the contending states of the central Chinese plains. The killing field casualties rose exponentially as the art of warfare progressed from swarming militia to the efficiency of phalanx-like fixed troop formations. At every level of innovation, from the introduction of cavalry to standard-issue crossbows to siege engines, these instruments of aggression made a folly of defense. Cities were walled and fortified only to be breached. Borders were drawn up only to be redrawn. Alliances were formed only to be betrayed. Treaties were signed only to be reneged upon. For generation after generation, death became a way of life, so that mothers gave birth to sons with the expectation that they would never reach majority. The eventual outcome was never in doubt. In the race to empire, the game was zero-sum, and to lose was to perish utterly. In the centuries of protracted labor that preceded the birth of this profoundly literate Chinese culture, the most widely circulated texts were not religious or philosophical treatises. They were military handbooks. In fact, most of the philosophers who traveled from court to court were purveyors of wisdom, guaranteed to lead their patrons to certain victory. And even when their expositions focused on the social and political reforms necessary for a flourishing state, at some point, almost every one of the texts named for them turns to warfare and to the necessity of a strong military. It was as a response to these darkest of days in which the blood of China's children irrigated the crops and their flesh fertilized the land, that the Tao Te Ching emerged as an alternative vision of what the human experience might be like. The world was wasting away, and the Tao Te Ching was a mysterious elixir that offered to serve as its restorative. The nature and applications of the Tao Te Ching. The great French sinologist Marcel Granet observed that Chinese wisdom has no need of the idea of God. Analogously, in this Chinese world in which nothing was created, including the world itself, the Tao Te Ching too appeared without the benefit of efficient cause. Of course, the text has long been associated with the sobriquet, the Lao Tzu, or the Old Master. But the historicity of this rather generic old man is as likely as his name is informative. What do we know about this authorless text? On the basis of rhetorical patterns and rhymes, William Baxter dates the Tao Te Ching to as early as 400 BCE, but suggests early or mid-4th century BCE as its most likely period of compilation. Given that it is widely cited in the late 4th and 3rd century BCE corpus, the Zhuangzi, Zhuangguo-tse, Lu Shi Chun Chiu, Han Fei Zi, and so on, the text in some form is likely to have appeared earlier rather than later. The 1993 recovery of 3 distinct bundles of strips dating to about 300 BCE that together constitute a partial Tao Te Ching from a tomb in Guodian, a village to the north of the ancient Chu capital of Jinanzheng in modern-day Hubei province, is consistent with Baxter's estimate. It is not clear whether this Guodian version of the Tao Te Ching is itself an interim phase circulating orally in the growth of the complete 81-chapter version, or whether it is someone's abridged version of an already existing complete text. But even in this partial text, however we choose to understand the term partial, the explicit anti-Confucian polemic suggests a date of compilation at which the Taoist and the Confucian lineages had already drawn their lines. Before we speculate on the authorless origins of the Tao Te Ching, it might be helpful to address the issue of orality. The relationship between the spoken and written languages of early China has had an important bearing on the past and the future of a text, that is, how a text would emerge over time out of the oral tradition, and how it would be transmitted to future generations. Elsewhere, together with Henry Rosemont, we have argued that classical Chinese is like the good little boy. It was primarily to be seen and not heard. A person who tried to write a speech in Wanyan today would end up with a soliloquy. This is not to imply that sounds were and are totally irrelevant to the written language, for some puns and all rhymes, alliteration, and so forth are obviously phonetic in character. Further, such linguistic devices were undoubtedly of enormous value in facilitating the memorization of large tracts of text that could be recalled to fund discussion. What this does imply is the following, which is an important premise for our overall position. Spoken Chinese is and was certainly understood aloud. Classical Chinese is not now and may never have been understood aloud as a primarily spoken language. Therefore, spoken and literary Chinese are now and may always have been two distinct linguistic media, and if so, the latter should clearly not be seen as simply a transcription of speech. The claim that the written language is not a transcription of speech is qualified in this argument by the acknowledgement that in a largely, if not primarily, oral tradition, much of the language that at some point and for specific reasons comes to be written down has earlier been transmitted from memory, and in this form enriches refined speech much as the crafted apothegms of Shakespeare, Pope, Nietzsche, and Emerson abound in good intellectual conversation today. D.C. Lau tells us a lot about the text. In preparing his own translation of the Tao Te Ching, he has followed the ubiquitous division of the short text into two books, the Tao Classic and the De Classic, and has also respected the further traditional rendering of the text into 81 chapters. But he takes one additional step in dividing these 81 chapters into 196 sections, with even more additional subsections, justifying this seeming fragmentation of the work on the basis of internal rhymes and the observation that there is only a very loose sense of textual coherence. Lau also suggests that the rhymed passages that constitute more than half of the text were probably learned by rote, with the meaning explained at length in an oral commentary. Michael Lafargue offers us some further insight into the nature and function of the Tao Te Ching. He argues that the text does not teach philosophical doctrines, but rather contains sayings that fall into two groups: polemic proverbs that seek to correct some common assumption, cheaters never prosper, and sayings that recommend a certain regimen of self-cultivation. Lafargue makes a further important point in insisting that, contrary to the standard hand-wringing about the impenetrability of the text, the words usually conveyed a single definite meaning for a group of people with a shared competence. That is, the sayings that constitute the text were largely meaningful to its anticipated audience within the context of their own historical period and life experience. If we combine and expand upon the insights that we have rehearsed above, we can make a reasonable conjecture about the provenance, the coherence, and the applications of the Tao Te Ching. First, the fact that remarkably similar bamboo strip and silk manuscript versions of the Tao Te Ching are being found in archaeological sites from significantly different times and places testifies to the probability that we are dealing very early on with a canonical text, if not a widely popular classic. We have put text in quotation marks and have used the expression classic advisedly, because the written form of the work seems to be derivative of an essentially oral tradition. Indeed, while we might be accustomed to think of such traditions of wisdom literature as being passed down through the written word, beyond the pervasive use of rhyme, there are other, rather clear indications that memorization and oral transmission probably played a major role in establishing a common frame of reference for the academic lineages of early China. The pervasive use of differing loan characters in the written forms of the Tao Te Ching and other recovered texts suggests that they represented sounds first, and then by context and inference, ideas. This would mean that they were part of an oral tradition that was written down from memory for some specific purpose, perhaps in this case providing reading material for the now silent tomb occupant in the journey to the nebulous world beyond. The accumulation of written texts also seems to have had a role in the construction of court libraries at state academies that would try to attract the best and brightest scholars of their age, and thus bring prestige to their patrons. Another factor that would have influenced this process of standardization is the relationship between a rich and redundant spoken language and texts which operate as an oral corpus of economical aphorisms to capture the prevailing wisdom of the time. These combined sayings would be available in the oral language as familiar apothegms that could be used as topics to begin discussions, with the possibility of further elaboration occurring in the vernacular language. While there seems to be a certain fluidity in the transmission of these early documents, the recent archaeological finds are uncovering increasingly earlier versions of relatively standardized texts, the Tao Te Ching among them, suggesting that rote memorization and canonization had some force in consolidating the texts and preserving their integrity. We would agree with Michael Lafargue that much of the rhymed materials found in the Tao Te Ching can be fairly described as a kind of proverbial wisdom literature that, rather than offering exposition, seeks to stimulate a sympathetic audience to conjure up the conditions necessary to make its point. A significant quibble with Lafargue, however, would be that these rhymed sayings are not only mnemonic, but are also memorable in the sense of the clever West African proverb tellers, or the evocative, epigrammatic, and scriptural sayings of our own tradition. That is to say, the aphorisms that came to constitute the Tao Te Ching should not be confused qualitatively or functionally with the familiar adages that Lafargue uses to make his own point. For example, nice guys finish last. Such banal clichés are seldom confused with wit or wisdom. By contrast, the elegant sayings that constitute the Tao Te Ching are the sound from the ground, sharing with other such conventional sources a widespread, often informal dissemination and the cultural function of sustaining a shared linguistic currency and a common wisdom within a competent population. By competent, we are following Lafargue in describing an audience with a similar worldview and common sense, precisely those assets lacking in our own contemporary attempts to engage the text. It is interesting to reflect on how such conventional sources, encompassing, among other things, everyday popular songs and their distillation in the Book of Songs, functioned to produce meaning and promote different philosophical agendas in the early Chinese corpus. What can be said about this largely oral medium of transmission and communication of songs is perhaps even more true of the layer of selected wisdom sayings that constitute the Tao Te Ching. David Schaberg explores the way in which uncanonical songs underwent a process of historical framing during the Warring States period and Qin dynasty, when commentators approached a song, often enigmatic and sometimes even incomprehensible, as an encoded means of communication that could only be understood and appreciated by fitting it with and within a particular historical anecdote of some interesting individual or event. A similar process seems to have been at work in the philosophical literature of this period, in which canonical songs, such as those collected in the Book of Songs, presumably widely remembered and sung by the population, were decoded when they were used to punctuate a particular philosophical point. That is, one intriguing characteristic of almost all of the classical texts, the Analects, Mozi, Mencius, Zhongyong, Shunzi, and so on, is that having presented some kind of a philosophical argument, they then quite literally break into song. And there seems to be a dividend for both philosopher and song alike in participating and being used in this practice. From the perspective of the song, it is framed and clarified, and is thus reauthorized as a shared and respected repository of ancient meaning, and the philosophers for their trouble get to claim the prestige of a canonical source for the assertion at hand. The song is a particularly effective addition to the philosophical argument for several reasons. It is persuasive by virtue of being widely known among the audience of the text. Again, the original source of the song is the daily life of the people, where each song is what Scheberg describes as a manifestation of complete and uncontrollable genuineness. This raw spontaneity and honesty lies in the fact that songs are most often the vehicles of either praise or blame, a public outpouring of approbation for some instance of virtuous conduct, or an irrepressible protest against some injustice. When these philosophical texts repeatedly burst into song, they are taking full advantage of the reader's assumption that such songs do not lie. Thus, when philosophers invoke a song, they not only seek to clarify their arguments, but also seek to attach the indisputable veracity of the song to their claims. The song further dramatizes the argument and charges it emotionally, bringing the more general and abstract assertions of the text down to earth by locating them in seemingly specific historical situations. Thus, a well-placed song lends veridical force to the philosopher's claims, and at the same time invests these claims with passion. It would seem that a great many hands across an expanse of time set down, sorted, resorted, edited, and collated the Tao Te Ching and the materials that constitute it. Little wonder that the text can initially give its readers the appearance of being fragmentary, disconnected, and occasionally even of being corrupt. It should not be surprising, then, especially to the modern Western reader who might be used to a more linear and sequential mode of presentation, that the Tao Te Ching seems to be something less than a coherent whole. But first impressions in this instance are belied as the architecture of the text emerges from different directions. First, when we turn to reflect on how the selected wisdom sayings of the Tao Te Ching function, we can assume that they, like the repertoire of songs, have a kind of unquestioned veracity that comes from belonging to the people and their tradition. We can further observe that this veracity is made corporate by a reading strategy that co-opts the reader. Two often remarked characteristics of the Tao Te Ching are palpable absences. It contains no historical detail of any kind, and it offers its readers no doctrines in the sense of general precepts or universalistic laws. The required framing of the aphorism by the reader is itself an exercise in non-dogmatic philosophizing, where the relationship between the text and its student is one of non-coercive collaboration. That is, instead of the text providing the reader with a specific historical context or philosophical system, its listeners are required to supply always unique, concrete, and often dramatic scenarios drawn from their own experience to generate the meaning for themselves. This inescapable process, in which students, through many readings of the text, acquire their own unique understanding of its insights informed by their own life experiences, is one important element in a kind of constantly evolving coherence. The changing coherence of the text is brought into a sharpening focus as its readers in different times and places continue to make it their own. Again, there is a greater degree of coherence to the Tao Te Ching than a first reading might suggest. Chapters are sometimes grouped around specific themes and subjects. For example, chapters 1 and 2 are centered on the theme of correlativity. Chapters 18 and 19 contrast natural and conventional morality. 57 through 61 all begin with recommendations on proper governing of the state. 67 through 69 are about prosecuting war. Chapters 74 and 75 deal with political oppression and the common people, and so on. Another source of coherence in the Tao Te Ching lies in the fact that it, like so many classical Chinese texts, is read and appropriated paronomastically. That is, a close reading of the text reveals repeated characters and metaphors that awaken in the reader an expanding web of semantic and phonetic associations. An additional observation to be made is that the rhymed sayings are not themselves a grab-bag miscellany of clever yet sometimes contradictory insights. On the contrary, it would seem that these specific aphorisms have been selected and edited to support the broader purpose of the text. Michael Lafargue and other prominent voices, notably Hal Roth, have argued persuasively that what gives the Tao Te Ching its indisputable focus is its overall didactic project. It would seem that the aim of the compilers of the Tao Te Ching is to prescribe a regimen of self-cultivation that will enable one to optimize one's experience in the world. These same wisdom passages are an integral element in this process that, when authenticated in the conduct and character of the practitioners, result in their personal transformation. It is important to note that this goal of self-transformation has nothing to do with death, judgment, and an afterlife, nor has it anything to do with the salvation of the soul, the traditional concerns of Western eschatology. Instead, such personal growth and consummation is meliorative in the sense of producing the quality of character that makes this world itself a better place. Having underscored the necessary collaboration between the reader and the text in the production of meaning, we are faced with the question as to our intentions in appending our own commentary after each chapter in this translation. The idea of writing an explanatory commentary seems to be as promising in its putative outcome as explaining a haiku. The commentary, then, is intended as no more than a suggestive footnote that is successful only to the extent that it sparks the reader's own engagement with the chapter itself. If it is treated as systematic or exhaustive or authoritative, it has ironically betrayed the reader that it is intended to serve. Philosophical Introduction. Correlative Cosmology, an Interpretive Context. 1. Optimizing Experience. This focus and its field. We will argue that the defining purpose of the Tao Te Ching is bringing into focus and sustaining a productive disposition that allows for the fullest appreciation of those specific things and events that constitute one's field of experience. The project, simply put, is to get the most out of what each of us is, a quantum of unique experience. It is making this life significant. In his early work in articulating the assumptions underlying Chinese natural cosmology, Tang Junyi is saying something similar when he summarizes what he takes to be the most crucial contribution of Chinese culture broadly. It is the spirit of the symbiosis and mutuality between particular and totality. In terms of our understanding, this means an unwillingness to isolate the particular from the totality, and in terms of feeling, it means the commitment of the particular to do its best to realize the totality. If this is indeed the defining problematic of the text, it might help us understand at least one insight conveyed in its title, the Tao Te Ching. The scores of translations that have introduced this text to the Western Academy have deferred to the difficulty of making sense of the title by conventionally leaving it untranslated. Alternatively, They have simply titled it after its putative author, the Old Master, still leaving it untranslated as the Lao Tzu. While almost all translators have skirted the problem of rendering the title into English by simply Romanizing it as Tao Te Ching, a few earnest souls have stepped up and offered their best effort, each of them emphasizing either a different dimension of the work itself, or a more subjective understanding of what the text means to them. Herbert A. Giles, 1886, for example, underscores the always laconic, often opaque, and sometimes even tentative diction of the text in calling it the remains of Lao Tzu. G. Alexander, 1895, takes a figurist approach, finding in the text echoes of his own religious sensibilities. Lao Tse, the great thinker with a translation of his thoughts on the nature and manifestation of God. Seeming to rescue this protean piece of literature for perhaps gray but always responsible philosophy, Paul Karras and D.T. Suzuki, 1913, render the title, The Canon of Reason and Virtue, Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. But reason, for these scholars, turns out to be divine reason, and the Son of Heaven is the high priest of the people who must bear the sins of mankind. While sensitivity to the religious dimension of the text, albeit a sensitivity derived from a tradition radically different from its own, is its own virtue, the sin of mankind is certainly increased by half in their willingness to reduce the Tao Te Ching's exquisite poetry to rather unremarkable doggerel. Even doggerel has its standards. Witness chapter 6. The valley spirit not expires, mysterious woman 'tis called by the sires. The mysterious woman's door, to boot, is called of heaven and earth the root. Forever, and aye it seems to endure, and its use is without effort sure. Perhaps the most widely known and accepted English translation of the title is Arthur Waley's, 1934, The Way and Its Power, a study of the Tao Te Ching and its place in Chinese thought. While seemingly secular and more dynamic, Waley's popular title still suggests our familiar one-many metaphysics. In this title, the demonstrative and possessive pronouns nominalize the way and isolate it metaphysically as the one source of order for a universe that is ordered by it, locating the energy of creative transformation in this superordinated agency as its power. Further, the use of a capital W invests this way semantically as a metonym for the transcendent and divine. Waley's language might sound more liberating, but his title still promises a version of the Tao Te Ching located squarely within a worldview more familiar to his readers than relevant to the text. We want to introduce a translation of the title that attempts, however imperfectly, to capture the defining purpose of the text stated above, bringing into focus and sustaining a productive disposition that allows for the fullest appreciation of those specific things and events that constitute one's field of experience. Of course, there is no one correct translation of the title Tao Te Ching. Were we to give priority to the cosmological insights provided by the text, we might render Tao Te Ching as the classic of this focus, De, and its field, Tao. If instead we wanted to emphasize the outcome of living according to this cosmology, we might translate it as feeling at home in the world. But with deliberation, we choose to underscore the human project that has prompted the articulation of Taoist cosmology and is inspired by it. Thus we translate Tao Te Ching as making this life significant. The philosophical introduction that follows will stand as our clarification of this translation and as an argument that seeks to defend it. 2. Taoist cosmology and interpretive context. We begin our argument for translating Tao Te Ching as making this life significant from Taoist cosmology. Taking a closer look at the interpretation of both the title and the content of the Tao Te Ching as the classic of this focus, De, and its field, Tao, we might first ask, what does the expression, this focus, mean? The Taoist correlative cosmology begins from the assumption that the endless stream of always novel yet still continuous situations we encounter are real, and hence that there is ontological parity among the things and events that constitute our lives. As a parody on Parmenides, who claimed that only being is, we might say that for the Taoist, only beings are, or taking one step further in underscoring the reality of the process of change itself, only becomings are. That is, the Taoist does not posit the existence of some permanent reality behind appearances, some unchanging substratum, some essential defining aspect behind the accidents of change. Rather, there is just the ceaseless and usually cadenced flow of experience. In fact, the absence of the one behind the many metaphysics makes our uncritical use of the philosophic term cosmology to characterize Taoism, at least in the familiar classical Greek sense of this word, highly problematic. In early Greek philosophy, the term cosmos connotes a clustered range of meanings, including arche, originative, material, and efficient cause, ultimate, undemonstrable principle; logos, underlying organizational principle; theoria, contemplation; nomos, law; theos, divinity; nous, intelligibility. In combination, this cluster of terms conjures forth some notion of a single-ordered divine universe governed by natural and moral laws that are ultimately intelligible to the human mind. This cosmos terminology is culturally specific, and if applied uncritically to discuss the classical Taoist worldview, introduces a cultural reductionism that elides and thus conceals truly significant differences. The Taoist understanding of cosmos as the 10,000 things means that, in effect, the Taoists have no concept of cosmos at all, insofar as that notion entails a coherent, single-ordered world which is in any sense enclosed or defined. The Taoists are, therefore, primarily acosmotic thinkers. One implication of this distinction between a cosmotic and an acosmotic worldview is that, in the absence of some overarching arche, or beginning, as an explanation of the creative process, and under conditions which are thus anarchic in the philosophic sense of this term, although the nature of something might indeed refer to kinds, such natural kinds would be no more than generalizations made by analogizing among similar phenomena. That is, difference is prior to identifiable similarities. The Chinese binomial most frequently translated as cosmos is Yu-Zhou, a term that overtly expresses the interdependence between time and space. The world, as Shi-Jie, is likewise expressed literally as the boundaries between one's generation and the tradition. For ancient China, time pervades everything, and is not to be denied. Time is not independent of things, but a fundamental aspect of them. Unlike traditions that devalue both time and change in pursuit of the timeless and eternal, in classical China things are always transforming. Wu Hua. In fact, in the absence of some claim to objectivity that objectifies and thus makes objects of phenomena, The Chinese tradition does not have the separation between time and entities that would allow for either time without entities or entities without time. There is no possibility of either an empty temporal corridor or an eternal anything in the sense of being timeless. What encourages us within a Western metaphysical tradition to separate time and space is our inclination, inherited from the Greeks, to see things in the world as fixed in their formal aspect, and thus as bounded and limited. If instead of giving ontological privilege to the formal aspect of phenomena, we were to regard them as having parity in their formal and changing aspects, we might be more like classical China in temporalizing them in light of their ceaseless transformation, and conceive of them more as events than as things. In this processual worldview, each phenomenon is some unique current or impulse within a temporal flow. In fact, it is the pervasive and collective capacity of the events of the world to transform continuously that is the actual meaning of time. A second assumption of Taoist cosmology, now using this term cosmology under advisement, that follows from this acknowledgment of the reality of both change and the uniqueness that follows from it, is that particular things are in fact processual events, and are thus intrinsically related to the other things that provide them context. Said another way, these processual events are porous, flowing into each other in the ongoing transformations we call experience. Formation and function, the shape of things and what they do to whom, are interdependent and mutually determining characteristics of these events. It is for this reason that things resist definition in the literal sense of finis, a practice that delineates some ostensibly discrete boundary around them, and thus reduces all relations to external, extrinsic transactions. With fluid and shifting boundaries among things, integrity for any particular thing does not mean being or staying whole, or even actualizing its own internal potential. Rather, integrity is something becoming whole in its co-creative relationships with other things. Integrity is consummatory relatedness. Integrity in this sense of becoming whole in one's relations with other things is a co-creative process in which one shapes and is shaped by one's environing circumstances. Not only is change an integral characteristic of things, but real creativity is a condition of this continuing transformative process. That is, our immediate experience is composed of fluid, porous events that entail both persistence and the spontaneous emergence of novelty, both continuity and disjunction. In this evolving order there is at once a familiar rhythm to life and the newness of each moment. The irrepressible presencing of novelty within the context of what already exists guarantees the uniqueness of each emerging event, and preempts notions such as strict linear causality, absolute predictability, and reversibility. The world is ever new, and the propensity of things, the force of circumstances, inching ahead in its seeming ineluctability, is always underdetermined, attended as it is by the contingency of real novelty. In our introduction to the Focusing the Familiar, a translation and philosophical interpretation of the Zhongyang, we introduce a distinction between power and creativity, and follow A.N. Whitehead in questioning the appropriateness of using creativity in the familiar creatio ex nihilo model that we associate with Judeo-Christian cosmogony. Whitehead argues that any robust sense of creativity requires that creativity itself is more primordial than God. In the received Judeo-Christian tradition, the all-powerful God determines things, makes things. God, as omnipotent other who commands the world into being, is maker of the world, not its creator. In the presence of the perfection that is God, nothing can be added or taken away. There can be no novelty or spontaneity. Thus, all subsequent acts of creativity are in fact secondary and derivative exercises of power. Creativity can make sense only in a processual world that admits of ontological parity among its constitutive events and of the spontaneous emergence of novelty. Power is to be construed as the production of intended effects determined by external causation. Real creativity, on the other hand, entails the spontaneous production of novelty, irreducible through causal analysis. Power is exercised with respect to and over others. Creativity is always reflexive and is exercised over and with respect to self. And since self, in a processive world, is always communal, creativity is contextual, transactional, and multidimensional. Thus, creativity is both self-creativity and co-creativity. Either everything shares in creativity, or there is no creativity. Indeed, it is this transactional, co-creative character of all creative processes that precludes the project of self-cultivation and self-creation from being egoistic. One further point can be made with respect to the creativity that the spontaneous emergence of novelty makes possible. The radical sense of creativity that we associate with bringing into being in a creatio ex nihilo sensibility is too isolated and extreme for this idea within the Taoist tradition. The term Tao, like the terms building, learning, and work, entails both the process and the created product. It is the locus and the time frame within which the always contextualized creativity takes place. When the Zhuangzi observes that we are one with all things, this insight is a recognition that each and every unique phenomenon is continuous with every other phenomenon within one's field of experience. But is this an exhaustive claim? Are we talking about all phenomena in the continuing present? Because the world is processional, and because its creativity is ab initio rather than ex nihilo, a contextual creativity expressed across the careers of its constitutive phenomena, any answer to this question would have to be provisional. Phenomena are never either atomistically discrete or complete. The Zhuangzi recounts, with the ancients, understanding had gotten somewhere. Where was that? Its height, its extreme, that to which no more could be added, was this. Some of these ancients thought that there had never begun to be things. The next lot thought that there are things, but that there had never begun to be boundaries among them. A third assumption in the Taoist cosmology is that life broadly construed is entertained through and only through these same phenomena that constitute our experience. The field of experience is always construed from one perspective or another. There is no view from nowhere, no external perspective, no decontextualized vantage point. We are all in the soup. The intrinsic, constitutive relations that obtain among things make them reflexive and mutually implicating, residing together within the flux and flow. This mutuality does not in any way negate the uniqueness of the particular perspective. Although any and all members of a family have implicated within them and thus present, rather than represent, the entire family, all members constitute and experience the family from their own particular point of view. And members, in making the family their own, quite appropriately have a distinctive proper name. A corollary to this radical perspectivism is that each particular element in our experience is holographic in the sense that it has implicated within it the entire field of experience. This single flower has leaves and roots that take their nourishment from the environing soil and air. and the soil contains the distilled nutrients of past growth and decay that constitute the living ecological system in which all of its participants are organically interdependent. The sun enables the flower to process these nutrients, while the atmosphere that caresses the flower also nourishes and protects it. By the time we have cashed out the complex of conditions that conspire to produce and conserve this particular flower, one ripple after another, in an ever-extending series of radial circles, we have implicated the entire cosmos within it without remainder. For the Taoist, there is an intoxicating bottomlessness to any particular event in our experience. The entire cosmos resides happily in the smile on the dirty face of this one little child. If the insistent particular, de, is holographic, how does differentiation occur among particular things? In the human community, for example, what does it mean for a person to become distinguished and an object of deference? First, this holographic sensibility is not simply Taoist, but a shared commitment of classical Chinese natural cosmology. The Confucian Mencius, for example, is also articulating this classical Chinese common sense when he interprets the field of qi in terms of moral energy and offers his advice on the attainment of human excellence. He speaks of his ability to nourish his flood-like qi, Haoran Ji Qi, describing this qi as that which is most vast, Ji Da, and most firm, Ji Gang. Restated in the language of focus and field, Mencius is saying that his flood-like qi has the greatest extensive and intensive magnitudes. This language of extensive field and intensive focus suggests that one nourishes one's qi most successfully by making of oneself the most integral focus of the most extensive field of qi. In this manner, one gains greatest virtue, excellence, potency, in relation to the most far-reaching elements of one's environs. As we read in the Mencius, everything is here in me. There is no joy greater than to discover creativity, Zheng, in one's person, and nothing easier in striving to be authoritative in one's conduct, Ran, than committing oneself to treating others as one would oneself be treated. Our argument for translating Zheng as creativity in this Mencius passage is that its more familiar translations as sincerity and integrity in fact reference a creative process. Sincerity as effective tone is the ground of growth in mutual relationships, and integrity is the becoming one that occurs as we become intimate. The deepening of these relationships that in sum constitute us as a person is a profoundly co-creative process of doing and undergoing, of shaping and being shaped. The Taoist variation on the efficacy of one's flood-like qi is the way in which the intensive focus of one's insistent particularity, de, provides the most extensive range of influence or potency in shaping one's world. Said simply, persons who have their stuff together change the world around them. In Chapter 54 of the Tao Te Ching, the cultivation of personal excellence is described as the starting point in world-making and in enhancing the ethos of the cosmos. Cultivate it in your person, and the character you develop will be genuine. Cultivate it in your family, and its character will be abundant. Cultivate it in your village, and its character will be enduring. Cultivate it in the state, and its character will flourish. Cultivate it in the world, and its character will be all-pervading. This relationship between intensive resolution and extensive influence is also captured in Chapter 23. Thus, those who are committed to way-making in what they do are on their way. Those who are committed to character in what they do achieve this character, while those who lose it are themselves lost. Waymaking is moreover enhanced by those who express character, just as it is diminished by those who themselves have lost it. Optimizing experience by getting the most out of it requires a kind of husbanding of one's resources, where husbanding is understood as a combination of cultivation and frugality. High resolution in one's character elevates one as a focal presence and as an enduring influence on the extended community through the patterns of deference that have come to define one's person. This achieved character provides the world with a resource for resolving its problems as they arise. Such is the import of Chapter 59. For bringing proper order to the people, and in serving Dian, nothing is as good as husbandry. It is only through husbandry that you come early to accept the way, and coming early to accept the way is what is called redoubling your accumulation of character. If you redouble your accumulation of character, all obstacles can be overcome, and if all obstacles can be overcome, none can discern your limit. Where none can discern your limit, you can preside over the realm. In presiding over the mother of the realm, you can be long-enduring. In this processual Taoist cosmology, continuity is prior to individuality, and the particular character or disposition of each event is thus an ongoing distinctive achievement. That is, each event distinguishes itself by developing its own uniqueness within the totality, and freedom is neither the absence of constraint nor some isolatable originality, but the full contribution of this achieved uniqueness to a shared community. A fourth presupposition of Taoist cosmology is that we are not passive participants in our experience. The energy of transformation lies within the world itself as an integral characteristic of the events that constitute it. There is no appeal to some external efficient cause, no creator God, nor primordial determinative principle. In the absence of any preordained design associated with such an external cause, this energy of transformation is evidenced in the mutual accommodation and co-creativity that is expressed in the relations that obtain among things. When turned to proper effect, this energy can make the most of the creative possibilities of any given situation. This kind of responsive participation we have characterized elsewhere as ars contextualis, the art of contextualizing. Ars contextualis is a way of living and relating to a world that quite simply seeks to get the most out of the diversity of experience. (3) Getting the most out of one's ingredients. The reality of time, novelty, and change, the persistence of particularity, the intrinsic, constitutive nature of relationships, the perspectival nature of experience. Taken together, these several presuppositions that ground the Taoist worldview and provide Taoism with its interpretive context set the terms for optimizing our experience. Or, said in a more metaphorical way, there is a strategy in the Tao Te Ching for getting the most out of the ingredients of our lives. The Confucian focus on the family, Jia, serves as a starting point for understanding this Taoist sensibility, for the Confucian project of self-consummation, although decidedly different in its parameters, has a similar objective. We have argued elsewhere that the family serves as a pervasive metaphor for social, political, and even religious relations within the Confucian worldview. The Analects 1:2 states explicitly that the way of conducting oneself most productively as a human being emerges out of the achievement of robust filial relations. Exemplary persons, Junzi, concentrate their efforts on the root, for the root having taken hold, the way, Tao, will grow therefrom. As for filial and fraternal responsibility, it is, I suspect, the root of authoritative conduct. Run. The underlying assumption is that persons are more likely to give themselves utterly and unconditionally to their families than to any other human institution. Thus, the family as an institution provides the model for the process of making one's way by allowing the persons who constitute it both to invest in and to get the most out of the collective human experience. Promoting the centrality of family relations is an attempt to ensure that entire persons without remainder are invested in each of their actions. The power of the family to function as the radial locus for human growth is much enhanced when natural family and communal relations are perceived as being exhaustive, without being construed as a distraction from, in competition with, or dependent upon any more fundamental relations, especially those characteristic of transcendental religiousness. It is from the family expanding outward that persons emerge as objects of profound communal, cultural, and ultimately religious deference, where the focus of religious reverence remains ancestral rather than supernatural or otherworldly. Human relations, far from being subordinated to one's relationship with one's God, are the concrete locus out of which religious feelings emerge. Ambrose King makes the argument that relationships within the classical Chinese cosmology are construed broadly in familial terms. We have gone further in suggesting that family is a more adequate metaphor than Joseph Needham's notion of organism for thinking about Chinese cosmology, and that arguably all relationships within this world are familial. This metaphor certainly has application to the Tao Te Ching, where rulership as an institution is naturalized on the model of the family, and explicit images of human procreativity, mother and infant, are projected onto the cosmos. In fact, the sustained, grand analogy that pervades the Tao Te Ching is, Tao is to the world as ruler ought to be to the people. Tao, the discernible rhythm and regularity of the world as it unfolds around and through us, is non-impositional. Waymaking, Tao, really does things non-coercively. This attitude is carried over into the human world. In governing effectively, coercion is perceived as impoverishing and dehumanizing. So the consummate political model in Taoism, corresponding to the consummate experience itself, is described as Wu Wei, non-coercive activity, and Ziran, self-sowing, or what is spontaneously so. As stated in Chapter 17, under the sway of non-impositional rulership, the people are able to be spontaneous. With the most excellent rulers, their subjects only know that they are there. The next best are the rulers they love and praise. Next are the rulers they hold in awe, and the worst are the rulers they disparage. With all things accomplished and the work complete, the common people say, "We are spontaneously like this." Spontaneity must be clearly distinguished from randomness and impetuosity. In fact, far from being uncaused, it is the novelty made possible by a cultivated disposition. Spontaneity is the punctuated flow and pressure of the calligrapher's brush. It is the singing dexterity of Cook Ding's cleaver. Spontaneous action is a mirroring response. As such, it is action that accommodates the other to whom one is responding. It takes the other on its own terms. Such spontaneity involves recognizing the continuity between oneself and the other, and responding in such a way that one's own actions promote the interests and well-being both of oneself and of the other. This does not lead to reductive imitation, but to complementarity and coordination. Handshakes and embraces are actions that presuppose a recognition of the relational stance of the other, and that complete that stance. In the dance hall of the cosmos, when the music for the next dance starts to play and partners open their arms to each other, the dance proceeds as a dyadic harmony of non-assertive actions. Four, appreciating the particular. This Taoist theme of optimizing experience might be explored more concretely by borrowing a memorable passage from William James. James alludes to a classical Western nursery rhyme, yet another kind of sound from the ground, to reflect on precisely the issue of how to get the most out of one's life experience. He at once asks and answers the question, what makes a life significant? Every Jack sees in his own particular Jill charms and perfections to the enchantment of which we stolid onlookers are stone cold, and which has the superior view of the absolute truth, he or we? Which has the more vital insight into the nature of Jill's existence as a fact? Is he in excess, being in this matter a maniac? Or are we in defect, being victims of a pathological anesthesia as regards Jill's magical importance? Surely the latter. Surely to Jack are the profounder truths revealed. Surely poor Jill's palpitating little life-throbs are among the wonders of creation, are worthy of this sympathetic interest. And it is to our shame that the rest of us cannot feel like Jack. For Jack realizes Jill concretely, and we do not. He struggles toward a union with her inner life, divining her feelings, anticipating her desires, understanding her limits as manfully as he can, and yet inadequately, too. For he is also afflicted with some blindness even here, whilst we, dead clods that we are, do not even seek after these things, but are contented that that portion of eternal fact named Jill should be for us as if it were not. Jill, who knows her inner life, knows that Jack's way of taking it, so importantly, is the true and serious way, and she responds to the truth in him by taking him truly and seriously too. May the ancient blindness never wrap its clouds about either of them again. Where would any of us be, were there no one willing to know us as we really are, or ready to repay us for our insight by making recognizant return? We ought all of us to realize each other in this intense, pathetic, and important way. If you say that this is absurd, and that we cannot be in love with everyone at once, I merely point out to you that, as a matter of fact, certain persons do exist with all enormous capacity for friendship and for taking delight in other people's lives, and that such persons know more of truth than if their hearts were not so big. What is particularly instructive about this excerpt from James is his claim that the sight of knowing the truth about Jill is Jack's heart. Both the magical importance of Jill as someone valued and the absolute truth about Jill as a matter of fact are realized concretely in these immediate feelings. Persons are constituted by their relationships, and these relations are valorized and made real in the process of persons bringing their fields of experience into focus. And it is Jack who focuses Jill with optimum resolution. the unmediated acknowledgement of Jill as one of the wonders of creation, resides in the affective relationships that give her context, particularly her Jack. This is only to say that the creative transactions, the doings and undergoings among persons, are a disclosure of their feelings for one another. Thus, affective tone and the subjective form of feeling are always entailed in the uniquely perspectival locus of the co-creative process. We feel our way forward into novel experience. When we turn to the Chinese language in which this Taoist worldview is sedimented, James's insight into the inseparability of fact and value, the cognitive and the affective, thinking and feeling, is revealed in its own way. The character Shin, often translated rather awkwardly as heart and mind, is itself an argument for the assumed indivisibility of knowing and feeling within this antique tradition. Shin is a stylized pictograph of the aorta, associating it quite immediately with the heart and the emotional connotations that attend it. The fact that the character Qing, that we translate as emotions or feelings, is a combination of this Shin and a phonetic element, Qing, justifies this understanding. Indeed, many, if not most, of the characters that entail some dimension of emotions and feelings have Shin as a component element. However, the fact that Shin has as often been rendered as mind should also alert us to the possible inadequacy of simply translating it as heart. Many, if not most, of the Chinese characters that refer to different modalities of thinking are also constructed with Shin as a component. Indeed, there are many passages in these classical texts that would not make sense in English unless the Shin thinks. The point is that in this classical Chinese worldview, broadly conceived, the mind cannot be divorced from the heart. There are no altogether rational thoughts devoid of feeling, nor any raw feelings altogether lacking in cognitive content. Having said this, the prejudice to which Taoism is resolutely resistant is the dichotomy between the cognitive and the affective that would privilege knowing as some separate cognitive activity. A.N. Whitehead expresses this same concern when he observes that mothers can ponder many things in their hearts that words cannot express. Concrete feelings, the real sight of knowing, become selectively abstracted and impoverished when they are resolved into the rational currency of names, concepts, and theories without adequate deference to the affective ground of this cognitive superstructure. In this early Chinese natural cosmology, in which process and change have priority over form and stasis, it is frequently observed that, with respect to the common sense understanding of the human body, physiology has priority over anatomy, and function takes precedence over sight. In this resolutely non-dualistic worldview, the Shin, then, is primarily a dynamic system that is metonymically associated with, but in no way exhausted by, its dense center, the anatomical heart and mind. This being the case, it might well be argued that Shin means primarily thinking and feeling, and then derivatively and metaphorically the organs with which these experiences are allied. In the passage cited above, James allows that every Jack is enchanted by the charms and perfections of his own particular Jill. The enchantment in the thoughtful feelings of Jack and Jill emerges in their mutual and reciprocated sensitivity and awareness. This kind of shared appreciation means several things. Certainly, they recognize better than most the quality, significance, and magnitude of each other, and in so doing admire each other greatly. But this burgeoning capacity for mutual appreciation goes well beyond simply a personal enjoyment of each other that begins and ends in their relationship. Indeed, this appreciation spills over to become value-added, quite literally raising the value of the cosmos in which they occur. Their shared cosmos is much appreciated, becoming a more magnificent time and place because of the profound feelings Jack and Jill have for each other. It is this capacity of the human experience to enchant the cosmos, then, that is the more important meaning of appreciating the particular. (5) The mutual entailing of opposites. In the Book of Changes, experience itself is defined simply as a succession of yin and yang phases. This description is an abstract way of making the empirical observation that all predicates give way to their opposites. Order and disorder succeed each other, and so on. This characteristic of experience is ascribed to the natural cyclical movement of qi, rather than some supernatural force, and is captured and made explicit in the metaphorical language of yin-yang and the 5 phases cosmology. As Chapter 40 of the Tao Te Ching observes, the mutual entailing of opposites means that whatever goes out and becomes consummately distinct also returns. Returning is how way-making moves, and weakening is how it functions. The events of the world arise from the determinate, and the determinate arises from the indeterminate. The most basic meaning of returning restates what has been said above. As Dang Junyi reports, cosmology is not simply a linear zero-sum victory of order over chaos driven by some external cause, but rather is the endless alternation between rising and falling, emerging and collapsing, moving and attaining equilibrium that is occasioned by its own internal energy of transformation. This cosmic unfolding is not cyclical, in the sense of reversibility and replication, but is rather a continuing spiral that is always coming back upon itself, and yet is ever new. It is the disposition of all things that their present condition entails its opposite. The Tao Te Ching observes in Chapter 58, "It is upon misfortune that good fortune leans. It is within good fortune itself that misfortune crouches in ambush. And where does it all end?" This insight into the mutuality of opposites has several implications. Perhaps most obviously, young is young becoming old, dark is dark becoming light, soft is soft becoming hard. In the fullness of time, any and all of the qualities that define each event will yield themselves up to their opposites. Those who are born into the world and live to grow old will eventually die. Anything that embarks upon this journey toward fruition has, in its first few steps, set off on the long road home. And it is at the moment of setting out as a newborn infant that a person has maximum potency. Thus, the journey can fairly be characterized both as a returning and a gradual weakening of one's initial promise. And it is by effectively husbanding this potency over one's career that one is able to make the most of one's experience. By anticipating the changes in your conditions, and by remaining focused, despite the unavoidable vicissitudes that are visited upon you as you move along the continuum from beginning to end, you are able to optimize the possibilities at each moment, and thus enjoy the ride to its fullest. Cultivating a proper disposition and being prepared for the seasons through which you pass from birth to death will enable you to consistently get the most out of your circumstances. It is your resolution, the intensity found at the center, that will keep your life experience in focus, establish you as an object of deference, and enable you to enjoy both a productive life and a healthy death. Said another way, to lose focus and stray off course along the way while on this journey will precipitate reversion. Squandered energy while young will age you prematurely. As it says in chapter 55, "For something to be old while in its prime is called a departure from the way of things, and whatever departs from the way of things will come to an untimely end." Aggression directed at others will, like Monsieur Guillotine's guillotine, come back to shorten your own life. Again, as in chapter 74, to stand in for the executioner in killing people is to stand in for the master carpenter in cutting his lumber. Of those who would thus stand in for the master carpenter, few get away without injuring their own hands. The world around us is always an interface between persistent form and novelty, the familiar honeycombed by the unexpected. The new emerges within the context and the security of the ordinary, and in due course, what was new overtakes and supplants the ordinary, and what was ordinary becomes an increasingly fragile memory for those who can still remember. In time, the new becomes the newly ordinary, and the ordinary returns whence it came. Six. Aesthetic harmony. At this point, we would like to introduce a few technical terms of aesthetic analysis that might be applied in explaining the particularly Taoist mode of attaining and sustaining harmony. This vocabulary is drawn from the work of A.N. Whitehead's Process and Reality, a philosophical work that is grounded in an aesthetic sense of order. According to Whitehead, there are four fundamental variables that contribute to the achievement of that harmony deriving from a balance of simplicity and complexity. These variables are triviality, vagueness, narrowness, and width. Triviality involves an excess of differentiation. It is complexity without contrast. An order is trivial when it is characterized by an excess of differentiation among its elements, all of which are entertained equally and are given equal importance. Systems theory would call triviality an excess of information leading to the production of dissonance. It is mere noise. It is chaos. There is no organizing strategy, no hierarchy, no differential importance. This is sheer multiplicity without focus or discretion. Vagueness, as Whitehead uses the term, is an excess of identification. In a vague order, the differences among items are irrelevant factors in constituting the order. It is simplicity without contrast. The vague order displays an undifferentiated commonality of character. Vagueness is a bland field without particular focus. It is the facile and unconsidered use of generalizations. Narrowness is an emphasis upon certain components in an order at the expense of others. It is simplicity in search of intense contrast. An order dominated by narrowness has an intensity of focus that backgrounds all other strongly differentiated factors. Matter of fact gives way to importance. Finally, width involves the coordination of differentiated elements, each with its own unique contribution to the order. It is complexity that sacrifices some contrast for depth and scope. The kind of discussion one would hope to have in an interdisciplinary university seminar would likely contribute to an order characterized by width. Width involves the balancing of narrowness and vagueness. A productive order has all four characteristics in various forms of background-foreground combinations. Vagueness and the mild identification it entails, when focused by the narrow, produces the contrasts appropriate to the production of harmony. Contrast involves the interweaving of triviality and vagueness through a shifting foreground-background gestalt, while the depth of contrast in an order is a function of its degree of complexity. The Tao Te Ching centers its discussion on cultivating the most productive relationship between the vagueness of the continuous field of experience and the narrowness of the insistent particulars. One pervasive theme of the text is that coercive, contentious activity diminishes the balance between focus and field. On the other hand, non-coercive relatedness encourages width, and the alternation between vagueness and triviality provides contrast. The abstractness of the Tao Te Ching and the absence of any concrete illustrative examples trades potential complexity and intensity that would be provided by these specific cases for an accommodating width, thus allowing it to be broad in its relevance and application. The role of the reader, then, is to supply the narrowness needed to create the intensity and deepen the degree of contrast. This language of aesthetic analysis can be regarded as germane to the dispute between the naturalistic Taoists and the more narrowly human-centered Confucians that we find both in the Tao Te Ching and in the Analects of Confucius, and in the tradition more broadly conceived. From a Confucian point of view, the vagueness of human relatedness is brought into focus through the performance of hierarchical roles and formal practices, Li. Through these ritualizing institutions, all human beings are able to take a stand and to find their place by establishing a value that is relative to the value of other members of their community. Ritualized living is an instrument for personalizing institutions and registering the narrowness and intensity of each human perspective, while allowing for enough width to promote effective tolerance. The Confucian argument would insist that the narrowness of human concerns provides the necessary intensity, while the Taoists' exaggerated inclusiveness would move humanity beyond productive width in the direction of a non-productive vagueness. Thus, the central complaint of the Confucian about the Taoist vision of things is in the vagueness of the latter. In fact, the Confucian accuses the Taoist explicitly of sacrificing the intensity that comes with a narrow focus for an inclusiveness that is too thin and diffuse. In response, the Taoist, as a student of the arts of the Chaos Clan, would insist that the Confucian claim to narrowness is bogus. Indeed, the insistent particularity, de, of human beings, and the possible intensity of their natural feelings is trivialized by recourse to contrived rules and artificial relationships that are dehumanizing, and by strategies for social regulation that privilege an ordered uniformity over spontaneity. Further, the absence of concern about the natural environment transforms Confucian narrowness into a kind of intolerance and exclusiveness that jeopardizes the depth of contrast and the intensity of one's experience provided by appropriate width. Confucian narrowness, the Taoist might well argue, leads socially to nepotism, parochialism, and jingoism, and within the natural environment to anthropocentrism, speciesism, and the pathetic fallacy. For the Taoist, the only guarantee of a viable narrowness would be to allow for the non-trivialized expression of each perspective in the environment to be registered and accounted for, human and otherwise. Indeed, Li and its perceived intolerance of the world beyond the human community leads to a thinness of experience, and with it, a diminution of imagination and creativity. The Taoists' guarantee against vagueness lies in an achieved disposition that is made manifest in the appropriate exercise of the Wu forms, Wu Wei, or non-coercive actions in deference to the De, particular focus of things, Wu Ji, or knowing that does not have recourse to rules or principles, and Wu Yu, or desiring that does not seek to possess or control its object. The deference implicit in these Wu forms facilitates width as an appropriate combination of triviality and vagueness, while maintaining the narrowness and the focus of insistent particularity. The point of this technical aside is a simple enough one, the interfusion of the variables leading to a balanced complexity of experience involves recourse to distinctly non-logical criteria. There is no means of establishing the superiority of triviality, or vagueness, or narrowness, or width, one over the other, because these are all presuppositions of a realized order. Nor is there any final science that could advise one as to the correct intermixing of these aspects of order. Similarly, consistent with the Taoist resistance to asserting any certitude or final vocabulary, there is no way of saying that Confucianism or Taoism is ultimately superior to the other by virtue of an appeal to univocal criteria. Nor is there any means of separating the two movements into distinctive schools on the basis of orthodoxies of belief or practice. There is no final truth either about the nature of things, or about the means whereby that nature is sought. The achievement of order and harmony in nature and society, that is to say, the achievement of effective way-making, or Tao, is a multifaceted effort that is dependent less upon uncovering true principles or right forms of conduct than on the exercise of imagination and creativity within the most deferential of contexts. In fact, the broadest context, the one leading to the richest resources for Chinese waymakers, has been built from the contributions of both the Confucian and the Taoist sensibilities.